Hello, and welcome back to the America 2 video series. My name is John Shar, and I will again be your host for the second video in the America 2 video series. Going forward and throughout the America 2 video series, you'll be seeing some split screens with me on one side speaking and an image of some sort of document like a list, a chart, a graph, a spreadsheet that provides a graphic illustration that dovetails with whatever the topic is that's being discussed on the other side of the screen. The introductory video in the series indicated that I'd be speaking, going forward, about the 8 most serious structural problems we face in getting America back on track and moving forward again as a society. Problems that are at present not on anyone's radar and which, because of that, are being completely ignored by the very people who are counting on most to solve them on our behalf. Right now, today, America is a free and prosperous society for about 53% of the citizens, and a much less free and less prosperous society for the remaining 47% of the citizens. Well, if these numbers are anywhere near accurate, and they are, it doesn't bode well for our country and our society, and we need to make corrections to these percentages before it gets so bad we can't restore the American dream to those from whom it's been taken over the past century. You probably already noticed that the screen on the other side of the split screen refers to 8 problems that you may never have heard any politician mention in your lifetime. And there is good reason for that. These 8 problems are the ones that the politicians created themselves. And since they created the problems and now don't know how to solve any of them, they are understandably reluctant to talk openly about any of them. In some, perhaps even many instances, the politicians were initially responding to what they considered to be an urgent need to protect the citizens in general. But a high percentage of the time, they defined the problems incorrectly and then implemented poorly thought out solutions that invariably benefited the government and the politicians more than they benefited the citizens in general. And in each instance, when the instant emergency, the depression, the war, natural disaster, terrorist threat, pandemic, and so on, passed, they left those poorly thought out solutions in place, just trotted them out again every time. After that, when a similar situation arose that they believed should be handled exclusively by the politicians and their parties and the lobbyists and the oligarchs that paid for their re-election campaigns. And in a nutshell, that is why things have been getting steadily worse for an ever-increasing number of citizens in our country over the past half to 3/4 of a century. Where did we go wrong? Where did we go wrong? Most of the time, it started with an incorrect diagnosis of the problem the politicians were setting out to solve. It is the case in government, as in all other fields of endeavor, that if a problem is defined incorrectly, the ensuing solutions to the problem will prove ineffective. That's science. And it applies to the social sciences like politics and government, just as it does to the physical sciences like physics and astronomy and mathematics. Now on the opposite side of the split screen, you're seeing a series of 8 problem-solving steps that originated with Aristotle about 2,400 years ago, that have come to be known as the scientific method of problem solving. In more than 2,400 years, no one's been able to improve on it. Aristotle was a smart guy. I'll go out on a limb here and say that Aristotle was possibly smarter than everyone presently serving in our government at every level, all put together. And certainly also smarter than anyone writing or hosting this video. Aristotle used the scientific method of problem solving to come up with a method of proposing and implementing laws designed to help people with a common interest in creating and advancing a worthwhile society for all the citizens of the society. Aristotle is one of the go-to guys you'll hear me refer to from time to time when looking at how present-day politicians present-day politicians measure both up in both intellect as well as leadership capabilities with some of the greatest minds the world has ever known. I lost my place in what I'm reading here. Hint, they don't measure up. The importance of symptoms in correctly defining problems. On the split screen now, you should be looking at a 2-page long list of 27 symptoms of societal decline that are now partially or completely ruining the lives of more than 160 million American citizens today and every day. Those 160 plus million citizens represent almost 47% of the nation's total population. And every one of the 160 plus million citizens is suffering from more than one of the symptoms on this list. Most of the 160 plus million are suffering from 10 or more of these symptoms, all at the same time, all day, every day. By way of a couple of examples, I want to offer some thoughts relating to just how important it is to first get the problems defined correctly. Example number 1, your upset stomach problem. For example, if your doctor advises you that he or she has diagnosed the malady as a stress-induced nervous stomach and proposes tranquilizers to remedy the problem while your problem is actually a diseased gallbladder with several overlapping similar symptoms, the tranquilizers not only won't cure the problem, but you may die of the proposed cure that resulted from an incorrect problem diagnosis. It also wouldn't help much. Let's go back to step number 4 and propose another treatment for a nervous stomach, like a different tranquilizer, or changing the size of the dosage of the medicine already being administered. The doctor would have to go all the way back to step 1 and look for another problem definition if your health problem was to be solved. Example number 2, borrowing and spending our way out of economic crises. In 2008, during the run-up to the complete collapse of the housing market, Congress decided that the problem was that the citizens who had already lost their jobs, homes, cars, most everything else, and now perhaps had a bankruptcy on their record thrown in for good measure, could be made whole by first providing the financial sector with trillions of almost interest-free dollars to lend. And then those financial institutions could lend it at a somewhat higher rate to those who are now jobless, homeless, on foot, and possibly bankrupt. And that's what they set out to do. They cranked up the printing presses at our Treasury and loaded up the financial sector, the Fed, failing commercial banks, failing Wall Street banks, failing mortgage companies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, failing insurance companies like AIG, and failing auto manufacturers, all except Ford, who bailed themselves out without government help, and a few other failing foreign governments and failing foreign banks. But then, the gotcha was revealed. After they already printed up and gave away almost 17 trillion, almost interest-free dollars, and pumped them into the failing commercial businesses, failing financial institutions, failing governments worldwide, they were, at least they pretended to be, surprised to learn that they were prohibited by law from lending it to those they said they wanted to help. Why? Because they were now shocked to learn those folks were not creditworthy. After all, the politicians then said we didn't want to start another round of bankruptcies and home foreclosures. My goodness, no to that. What to do? What to do? What to do? Well, what the financial institutions could have done would have been to give the money right back to the government, since the banks couldn't, by law, lend it out to citizens whose jobs, income, and mortgages the government had already destroyed. But the government, banks, and politicians decided that a better use of the almost interest-free money, now that it was already in circulation, would be to instead lend it to entities that they could lend it to legally, like the U.S. government and some other governments, and some commercial interests to build more factories in other countries to help them through the tough times too. And that way at least some of the lent money to the established commercial interests and the governments would eventually trickle down to the citizens in general. And that way everyone would theoretically benefit. Under the government's plan, some would of course benefit more and sooner than others, but everyone should eventually benefit, at least to some degree. The political doctors in Washington have proven themselves to be among the worst in the world at problem diagnosis. In fact, diagnosing problems is, among all the activities this group engages in, the thing that they decidedly do least well. America is suffering from an alarming number of symptoms of a society beginning to collapse in on itself. Just as a patient with AIDS or cancer typically expires from complications like congestive heart failure or pneumonia that take over when the virus or cancer is severely worn down the patient's internal defense mechanisms. America is on the verge of becoming so worn down from finding symptoms of decline that it stands in danger of expiring, from concentrating exclusively on ways to alleviate the symptoms of those problems while, at the same time, avoiding at all costs looking for cures to the root problems themselves. And because of this, American citizens may occasionally gain temporary relief from uncomfortable symptoms from time to time, but absent anyone looking for cures to the underlying problems, the problems themselves continue to grow and spread. And that being the case, symptomatic relief is predictably temporary in nature, and the symptoms reoccur frequently. And like with physical symptoms, the longer the underlying symptoms remain unaddressed, the underlying problems, remain unaddressed, the more difficult it is to treat the symptoms when they reoccur. And finally, just as with physical symptoms related to deadly medical diseases, wherein failing to identify and treat the disease itself ultimately results in the death of the patient, a continuing failure to identify and treat the deadly problems causing distress symptoms in American society can and may well ultimately cause the death of the great American experiment in self-government. Fortunately, there is still some time to act, but time is of the essence and growing shorter, even as you are reading or listening to this. At the risk of picking a fight, I presented here in the split screen a list of 27 symptoms of societal decline presently affecting broad segments of American society. There may be more that could be listed, and I apologize in advance if I left one off the list that's near and dear to you. Please keep in mind that my purpose in presenting the list is to provide some of the most notable examples of the kinds of topics typically presented by elected leaders to the public at large as problems, but which are in fact not problems at all. Instead, all of these are symptoms of problems that no one in government even talks about. I'm sure that there will be unemployed citizens out there that may respond by saying, well, if you were unemployed, then you would think that unemployment was a problem. Same thing for underemployed citizens. Citizens that aren't getting adequate medical treatment because they can't qualify for insurance coverage or can't otherwise afford treatment, and so on down the list. But the topics listed here are in fact not problems at all. They are symptoms of problems that no one is even talking about in government ever. Mistaking symptoms for problems. How does it happen? Well, elected leaders tend to refer to these symptoms as if they were in fact problems. And elected leaders then take individual positions regarding how best to address the topic at hand, and differences between different leaders' views as to how to bring symptomatic relief are referred to as taking a position on issues surrounding the problem of whatever the symptom is. Issues are points of argument over strategy, and standing one's ground in arguments over strategy is referred to among elected officials as taking a stand on principle. For example, an elected official might identify existing tax policy as something that was problematic. The official might then take a position that the corporation should pay more in taxes, so that individuals might have to pay a bit less. Other elected leaders might then take an opposite view, and each side would then allude to the necessity of addressing the issues surrounding tax policy. The issues then become perceived as the relative merit of each side's arguments supporting their views on the subject. And over time, in this example, tax policy, the elected leaders would eventually get around to voting on legislative bills supported by the strategy that supports the strategy of each side. And one side see their bill enacted into law, and the other side would not. And both the losers and winners would then make a big thing out of standing on principle. Most likely, within a few months or years, the losers of this round would come to be in the majority and revisit the issues of tax policy and win. And the tax policies of the previous winners would be reversed. And again, both sides would make a big thing about standing on principle. The reason that neither side's changes to tax policy remain in effect for long, and citizens periodically replace elected leaders that were predisposed to reversing a prior elected body's tax policies, which also failed to bring long-term relief, is that neither side began their quest with an accurate definition of the problem. Tax policy, if done badly, as it usually is, may spawn many symptoms that visit discomfort on citizens. But tax policy itself is a symptom of an underlying problem or problems. That being the case, unless the underlying problems are identified and solved, it is not just unlikely, it is a complete impossibility that tinkering with strategies surrounding individual elements of a symptom like the tax system will solve the underlying problems. And given this approach to problem solving by our elected officials, the only thing that is certain is that strategies relating to symptomatic relief will continue to be argued every year, and that the underlying problems that are being ignored will continue to get worse. As noted in the introductory video in this series, both of our main political parties have had adequate opportunities over the past half century to make things better, both individually, working alone, and collectively, working together. Much better, actually, but that hasn't happened. I indicated in the introductory video in this series that finding out why it hasn't happened would be a primary goal of the America 2 video series as we move forward. And now you know, if you didn't before, the biggest single reason why things haven't gotten better for America and Americans than they were 50 years ago, which was the question I asked you to consider in the introductory video in this series. Our politicians don't know how to define the problems we have to solve in order to get America moving forward again. And in those instances where they created the problems themselves, they avoid even acknowledging that the problems exist. Our politicians seem only to be interested in playing the quid pro quo political game, lining up money sources to help them pay for their next re-election campaign, practicing character assassination on their political opponents, and polishing their favorite talking points, while always avoiding answering any question put to them directly by their constituents or anyone else. That doesn't speak well of the great majority of our politicians and their lack of candor in owning up to their own past mistakes and using their extensive legal and political training to cleverly misdirect the news outlets and the rest of us and change the conversation away from a direct question posed to them and instead change the subject back to one of the talking points they feel comfortable talking about instead, has left most Americans in the dark about what our government has not only been doing for us as citizens, but also what our government has been doing to us as citizens. The for us and to us things are not usually the same thing, and they are not usually equivalent in measure either. The for us part is typically much less in measure than the to us part. In upcoming videos, as we dissect the 8 individual problems we'll be examining for possible solutions, we'll begin to compare further the benefits we've received from our politicians, the for us part of the equation, and the benefits the politicians and the government have received in return, the to us part of the equation. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening, and thanks for caring about our country and wanting to see it and us become all that we can be together. Be well.